Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. Recently I did 2 videos about Paul McCartney and his father Jim, and one viewer suggested I do another video about him. And since everyone seemed to like the videos, I decided to do that. So this time I found more information about Jim McCartney in the book Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney by Howard Soons. So let us see what else we can find out about this fascinating man who fathered a son who would help create an unforgettable band, the Beatles. Paul mentions his family beginnings. Paul was quoted as saying, "They may not look much, they're just very ordinary people, but by God they've got something, common sense, and the truest sense of the word. I've met lots of people, but I've never met anyone as interesting or as fascinating or as wise as my Liverpool family." So what a great compliment that he gave to them. The family Paul's dad was born into was very clannish, amicable, witty people who liked company, according to Jim's Aunt Joan. The appearance of the men in the family were slim, smartly dressed, and moderately handsome, and Paul's dad had delicate eyebrows and kindly eyes, which gave him an innocent expression that Paul inherited. The women in the family were more robust and in some ways more dominant. So music played a large part in the family life. Jim McCartney taught himself to play piano by ear. He was deaf in his right ear, but that didn't stop him from learning. And he also learned the trumpet, as I mentioned in my previous videos. Paul's father in the music business. Jim was a semi-professional musician during the First World War. He formed a dance band, the Masked Melody Makers, later called Jim Mack's Band, and his older brother Jack played the trombone. Jim made up tunes, but he never called himself a songwriter. When Jim was a young man, he worked in a theater briefly, selling programs and operating lights. Jim's day job was a salesman with the cotton merchants A. Haney and Company. He wasn't paid very well there, and it was said that Jim was having such a great time with his band that he waited till he was almost 40 before he married. During World War II, he lost his salesman's job, and he then had a job working in an aircraft factory during the day and fire watching at night. And once the war ended, Jim ended up back at A. Haney and Company. And then Jim and Mary married. The McCartneys lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs. This gave Paul access to the woods and meadows where he went exploring. He took with him a book called Observer Book of Birds and a supply of jam buddies. In the evening, his mother cooked and his dad smoked his pipe, read the newspaper, or worked in the garden. So the McCartneys got their first TV in 1953. And so did many other Britons at that time. They all wanted to watch the coronation of Elizabeth II. Well, Mary's death. Mary's job had the McCartneys moving to a new house in Allerton, and it was a pleasant suburb close to town. And they had just moved in when Mary became ill, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Mary knew things weren't going to go well, but she never told her boys. In the summer of 1956, Mike found his mom upstairs crying, and he asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing, love." October 1956, Mary was admitted to Northern Hospital. She had surgery, but it wasn't successful. And Paul and Mike were sent to stay with their Uncle Joe and Aunt Joan. Jim didn't have a car, so a friend named Mike Robbins gave Jim lifts to the hospital in his van. Mike said that Jim was putting on a brave face, but he knew his wife was dying. Later, the boys were brought in to say goodbye to their mother. Paul was 14 and Mike was 12. She died October 31st, 1956, at the age of 47. So next, Jim tries to cope. Paul remembered his father crying at night, and Jim had the help with the house, with Aunts Jenny, Millie, and Joan helping him out. They took turns cleaning and cooking for the guys, and Paul tried to cope with the loss of his mother by turning to music. He got a trumpet for his birthday from his father, but Paul really wanted a guitar, so he exchanged the trumpet for a Zenith guitar, because he wanted to sing as well as play an instrument. He also didn't want to have a callus on his lips. And when Paul first got into the band with John and George, they would sometimes practice at McCartney's house, and Jim would sit reading his paper. The piano was against the wall, and Jim would sit at the end of the piano facing out into the room, and if he thought they were getting too loud, he would wave his hand. He didn't want the neighbors to complain. At 4 o'clock, they would break, and Jim would make them a cup of tea. Paul and his dad regarding his career. So once Paul went to Hamburg as a silver Beatle, he came back more determined than ever to earn a living in a band. And Jim brought Paul back to earth, stating that he had had his fun, but now he needed to get a regular job. So Jim was kind of stern about this. Paul said that he virtually chucked me out of the house. It surprised Paul. Paul had money from jobs he had done in the past, working on a coal lorry, a delivery van, and a post office during Christmas time. The labor exchange sent him to his first real job at the electrical firm Massey and Coggins Ltd. He started by coiling electrical cables, but management wanted to train him to be a junior executive. John Lennon told Paul not to be so soft and to come back into the band. Paul did, but he kept the job for the time being. And then once the Beatles got Brian Epstein as their manager, Paul signed a contract with his father, co-signing since Paul was still under 21. And then Jim gets on Pete Best. So Jim went with the Beatles when they performed on June 11th, 1962 to perform for the BBC Light program. After the show, all the girl fans made a fuss over Pete Best more than they were the other Beatles. Well, that didn't sit very well with Paul's dad. He was waiting for them on the bus, and when Pete finally got on the bus, Jim started telling him off, saying he was trying to upstage them all. And Pete said it wasn't his fault that the girls were after him. So then, after a hard day's night, there was a premiere for the movie in London, and Jim McCartney brought a lot of relatives with him. Everyone was celebrating, and then they went to the Dorchester Hotel, and Paul introduced his father to Princess Margaret. That must have seemed unreal to him. Okay, and then we get to nearing the end of the part where the book talks about Jim and Paul. This is when Jim was in failing health, and Jim was an invalid in his Gayton bungalow, and he was nursed by Angie. And a neighbor named Doug McKenzie stated that Angie, she was very nice, and my God, she looked after Jim. So Jim rarely left home at this time. When the weather was good, he would sit on his front garden watching the world go by, and most of the time he stayed inside by the fire. His arthritis was crippling him, and he suffered from bronchitis. And it was at this time there were tensions between Paul and Angie over what needed to be done. When Paul visited Jim, he urged his father to be more active. And when he got bronchial pneumonia, Paul wanted his dad to go to the hospital. Angie insisted that she care for him at home because that's what Jim wanted to do, and he wanted to die in his own bed. Paul couldn't deal with what was going to happen to his father because of losing his mom at such a young age. And Jim died 2 days before Paul's show in Copenhagen. He died from pneumonia and heart failure with bronchitis and arthritis, underlying factors. Paul didn't go home for the cremation. Paul was in Berlin when Jim's ashes were scattered over the rose garden in front of the chapel. Jim's spot, as well as his mother's grave, have stayed unmarked because Paul probably didn't want fans finding them. So Denny Lane said he was shocked when he was in an interview with Paul and David Cassidy in France, and Paul never told him that his father had died. And he said he was physically shocked on camera, and David Cassidy said, "You should have seen the look on your face when he said that." He didn't tell me, and I wasn't that close to his dad, but I knew him quite well. I suppose Paul felt, I'm not going to get into that. This is the one thing you have to remember about Paul. He's a very, very private guy. He doesn't like to be talking about his family or anything to do with anything other than music, if he could possibly help it in public. He doesn't like to share certain things. He takes them on his own shoulders, and this may be part of his personality. He likes to stay positive because if he gets negative, he gets really negative, and he knows it. So he tries to rise above these things and not having other people reminding him of too many negative things or hurtful things because of who he is. He has to be out there looking like he's part Paul McCartney, happy-go-lucky, and not bothering the world with his problems. You can understand that. So he probably thought, Jesus, I can't handle all that. Paul's relationship goes sour with Angie. So in another video I did, I stated that Angie took her daughter to Spain soon after Jim's death. So that left the McCartney family feeling like it was an indecent haste. And then Angie decided to go into theatrical management, and Ruth continued to do her show business dreams. So they clashed with Paul over the phone regarding money. This was stated in an interview that Angie gave to the Sun newspaper. And then Ruth, Jim's stepdaughter, stated in a separate interview that Paul had stopped the £7,000 a year pension that had been paid by McCartney Production Ltd. to Jim. And Angie and Ruth then left the bungalow and moved to a flat. And this rift led to no communication, so that's kind of understandable. This is all the information regarding Jim and Paul together that I found in the book entitled Fab: An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney. So I thought it would be interesting doing another video of Jim and Paul using a different perspective that I got from this book. The last videos were made from the information that was in the book Paul McCartney by Philip Norman. So every book can give us something new that we didn't know before. As I've said before, if I find out more information about topics that I've made videos on before, I will be sure to do the videos on it. And because I'm sure there's more Wings information to uncover, and I know that there's a lot of Wings fans out there, and that goes for whatever new information I get about John, George, and Ringo too. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.